Recovery and Resiliency Funding series. So for folks who have not joined us before, the purpose of this series is to break down state and local funding opportunities to better help local governments and community partners navigate and access potential solutions for the challenges they're facing at the local level. So as Rick mentioned, we are focusing on hazard mitigation funding today. If you are familiar with our local community funding guide, you'll notice that hazard mitigation is usually grouped with public safety funding. But because there's so much information related to hazard mitigation, we are going to be breaking this down into two parts. Obviously today focusing on hazard mitigation, and we will look at public safety funding opportunities in the future. So today we have Mark Thompson and Nate Pearson. Mark Thompson is with our Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and Nate Pearson is a recovery officer with our Department of Natural Resources. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nate to kick us off.
Great. Thanks so much, Shale. Happy to be here. And as Shale said, my name is Nate Pearson, and I'm the recovery officer at the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. And so working to implement and track and report on and assist local governments in the drawing down of significant recent federal and state investments in a lot of programs, many of which fall into this hazard mitigation and resilience framework. And so really excited to talk to you all today about a few of the DNR's new programs in this space, and always happy to chat more about this. If folks want to reach out, my contact information is at the end. And then for each of the programs that I'll be talking about, I've included program-specific contacts that I encourage you to reach out to discuss with them. And so the first program I'll discuss is the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, or COSWAP for short. And this program was created in the 2021 legislative session via House Bill or Senate Bill 21-258. And the program has a two-pronged approach to wildfire mitigation and also workforce development. And so the goal is really to fund on-the-ground work on fuels reduction, across Colorado, but also to increase our capacity to do these types of projects into the future. And so in doing so, the program is sort of divided into two parts. The first is our workforce development section. And this is where we've entered into contracts with two organizations, the Department of Corrections, State Wildland Inmate Fire Teams, as well as conservation corps across Colorado. And so in both cases, wildfire mitigation crews are trained up, and as local governments or other groups apply for funding, the program essentially grants out the time and resources of these wildfire mitigation crews. For the workforce development side of the program, all that's required is an in-kind match in the form of project management services. The grant is open to federal and state agencies, local governments, tribes, public utilities, HOAs, nonprofits, and other collaborative groups. And really, really excited about both the immediate impact this will have on communities, but also the longer term impact that we're aiming for as far as expanding our capacity to do this work across the state. The second half of the program is our sort of strategic landscape focused investment, with the goal of conducting landscape scale projects in our highest priority fire sheds. And so this grant is open to local governments only. It requires a 25% match, and many of the same tenets of the program apply. I should say that while Senate Bill 258 only provided one-time funding initially, the General Assembly has since provided the program with ongoing funding. And so while there are no grant rounds currently open, there will be many future grant rounds, and I encourage you to both keep track of the announcements on the website, which is linked here, but also to reach out to either Allison Lurch, our program administrator, or Courtney Young, the program facilitator, to ask questions and talk more about it. They're always happy to chat with local governments and talk about the benefits of the program. With that, I will go to the next slide, please. Great. The second program I'll discuss is our new Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. And so for years, the Colorado Water Conservation Board has made grants in our watershed restoration grant program, largely to fund post-fire restoration work and largely emergency post-fire restoration work. And there were significant investments made by the state as well as many local governments in response to the 2020 wildfire season. You know, almost all of which was spent on direct intervention, emergency wildfire mitigation. The goal of the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program is to develop a framework to analyze and plan for the impacts of wildfires to our watersheds before the fires happen. And so this sort of innovative program is offering a pretty broad suite of potential eligible activities. And so you'll see here, I've got a list that projects are eligible for capacity building, including outreach, organization, communication, and management of planning activities. Grants are also offered for planning, including sort of building, these wildfire ready watershed frameworks or sort of similar flood after fire mitigation plans. Funds are available for engineering services, and funds are also available for implementation of the projects sort of developed through those first 3 bullet points. And so the funds are available to state agencies, local governments, nonprofits, watershed coalitions, as well as water conservation and conservancy districts and tribes. For the sort of first 3 bullets, so capacity building, planning, and engineering, a 25% match is required. For the final bullet, implementation, a 50% match is required, and up to half of that match may be in kind. It is worth noting that the funding source for the $10 million currently being managed by the grant program is the American Rescue Plan Act. And so these funds both are subject to sort of all federal management requirements and also have a timeline associated with them. So projects must be sort of all contracted and ready to go by December 30th, 2024, and have all funds spent by December 30th, 2026. And again, I'm always happy to talk about the program and the ARPA requirements associated with it, but I also encourage folks to reach out to Chris Sturm, our watershed program director, and he's always happy to have those conversations as well. Next slide, please. Great. And then the last program that I'll talk about in real detail here is the federal technical assistance grants for water projects. And so just stepping back briefly, I mentioned earlier that there's been significant recent investment, both at the federal level and the state level, in resiliency programs sort of across the board. Much of this investment has been in the water space. So there's significant new federal grants for watershed health and aquatic ecosystem health. And we, in addition to sort of all the other water funding available, we want to make sure that our communities are as successful as possible in drawing down those funding streams. And so last legislative session, we received funding from the General Assembly to offer technical assistance for communities or nonprofits that are going after federal grants. And so I just really want to highlight that this, for communities facing sort of the barrier of a lack of capacity to do the work necessary to actually just apply for a federal grant, this program offers a big bump in capacity, provided that the projects in question are water related. And so the allowable uses are really broad, to allow for the wide range of federal opportunities available. I've got a second slide here that I'll get to in just a minute that sort of talks about all of these steps and all of the types of things that these funds can be used for. But so eligible applicants are local governments, special districts, state agencies, nonprofits, mutual disc companies, and many others. And a 25% match is required, of which some can be in kind. The same qualifier that I gave on the last slide for wildfire ready watersheds applies to this. The funding source is American Rescue Plan Act funds. So all funds must be obligated by December 30th, 2024 and spent by December 30th, 2026. I should mention that 5 million was sort of the initial push for the program. About 1 million of that has already been obligated. So the full 5 million is not still available, but there's plenty to go after. The last qualifier that I'll give here is the program is sort of divided into two pieces to provide multiple options in how a community would like to sort of build this capacity. So half the funding is available sort of as a direct cash grant, for lack of a better term, and so that a community could draw down funds and hire a contractor or a term limited staff person to do all of this planning and grant writing. On the other side of the program, the CWCB has contracted with a sort of a central contractor whose time will be loaned to project participants, sort of as needed. So say you needed, 100 hours of engineering, 50 hours of permitting services, and 50 hours of grant writing. Our central contractor would handle that. You would not have to go through sort of a separate procurement process in order to utilize those services. And again, I'm always happy to talk about this program, but I encourage you also to reach out to Michael Reagan at the CWCB. His contact info is provided here. And next slide just quickly. So this just gives a broad overview of all the steps when you're planning a water project. What does it take to get from the seed of an idea all the way through construction and asset management? And so, really our program is meant to get folks from that sort of initial idea through funding strategy, environmental permitting, conceptual design, final design, grant writing, and actual application. And I find this graphic helpful, and always have to think that the Colorado River District was the one who pulled this graphic together to sort of show all the steps we need to get there. And you can see the arrows on the top are just showing sort of where in this process some of the federal grants pick up and where you need to be just to start for those programs. Next slide, please. Great. This slide, and I saw in one of the chats folks asking if these slides will be shared. It is my understanding that they will be shared, and I hope folks use the links here. But this is just sort of an overview of stakeholder resources in addition to the technical assistance that I mentioned. We're doing our best to do consistent outreach via webinars and conferences and individual phone calls. We also have 2 state-maintained lists of funding opportunities here specific to the issues that we're talking about here. So there's one for water and one for wildfire. And just to be clear, these grants should be captured in DOLA's sort of statewide funding opportunity tracker as well. But have found it helpful to have these sort of standalone issue-specific databases of funding opportunities. And then just always worth mentioning that where matching funds is a problem for folks going after grants, especially federal grants, that the state has opportunities for folks to match those funds. So funding provided at DOLA under Senate Bill 22-215 can provide matching funds for local governments, but also many of the existing state grant programs that we have can serve as matching dollars for federal grants as well. Next slide, please. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about these because these are all programs that reside outside of the Department of Natural Resources, but they're all great programs and sort of part and parcel with the approach that we're taking at DNR, and I just want to flag them. And so the first 3 that you're seeing here are all Colorado State Forest Service grant programs. So the Furworm Grant Program, or the Forest Restoration Wildfire Risk Mitigation Grant Program, provides grants to communities across the state to reduce the risk of wildfire. And also to promote forest health and forest restoration projects. Encourage folks to reach out to the Colorado State Forest Service to discuss it. There's also 2 new grant programs at the Colorado State Forest Service. One is the Wildfire Mitigation Incentives for Local Government Program, which will provide matching funds to local governments who raise revenue specifically for forest management or fuels reduction projects. And then the final new one is the Wildfire Mitigation Resource and Best Practices Grant Program, which provides support to local governments who are, looking to conduct outreach and communications among landowners in high hazard areas. To conduct outreach to get across to landowners all the steps they can take to protect themselves and their communities from the hazards of wildfire. And then finally, at the bottom here, Mark Thompson from the DHSCM will talk more about these, but These are a list of federal grant programs in the wildfire space, all of which can be really valuable for communities that are pursuing funds. With that, I think on the last slide, I've got my contact info. And as I said, please reach out if you ever have questions. I'm always happy to chat, as are the rest of our team that were listed throughout here. And thank you to Dola and Shale and Rick and everybody for the opportunity to talk to you all today. Thanks.
Thank you, Nate. I appreciate that overview. Very thorough. Shale, did you have anything more on the webinar?
Yep. So Mark Thompson from DHSEM will speak next.
Bravo. Thank you.
You bet.
Thanks, Shale, and good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Thompson, the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Really happy to be here this morning to talk to you. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about 4 FEMA mitigation grant programs that we administer at DHSEM. And Nate mentioned some of them. We'll go into a little bit more detail. The first one is the newest program that FEMA has. It's about 3 years old, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, also known as BRIC. This is an annual program that is extremely competitive nationally, and it is focused on infrastructure or community level projects that can be used to reduce risk from any natural hazard. The highlight of this program is that FEMA will fund up to $50 million towards a single project if it's selected. So to the best of my knowledge, that is the largest pot of money available to fund a single project that makes the program attractive for many communities. Next is FMA, or Flood Mitigation Assistance. This is another annual nationally competitive program. It is focused only on flood mitigation, with an emphasis on structures and communities insured under the National Flood Insurance Program. Then there's the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is a post-disaster program. There's 2 flavors of it. The larger one is triggered by a presidential disaster declaration in a state, but there's also a smaller version whenever FEMA declares a fire management assistance grant award. And some recent examples of those that we've seen that didn't become their own presidentially declared disasters would be the Lake Christine fire, the Spring Creek fire of 2018. So the ones that are large and on non-federal lands but don't rise to the level of a declared disaster. And then many of you may be familiar with a relatively new one, or at least reincarnated one, called the Legislative Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, but you probably know it as congressionally directed spending. This is a program that is now in its 3rd year. There are many federal departments involved in it. With FEMA, there's 2 programs, one for emergency operations centers, which our field operations team handles at HSEM, and then the pre-disaster mitigation, which funds projects similar to BRIC, any natural hazard. And so if you're familiar with this one, you'll make a request through your senator, or through one or both senators and or your congressional representative. And then if your project is selected, about a year later, you'll formally apply through us to FEMA to fund the project. So there's a lot of opportunity out there right now from FEMA. Next slide, please. It's important to note that these programs are intended to reduce long-term risk to people, property, and infrastructure only from natural hazards. And when I mean long-term, we're really looking at projects that will be effective for 20 to 50 years with maintenance along the way. And with that long-term emphasis, it's important to note that there is a long lead time for these projects. FEMA's applications are technically intensive. They are kind of time-consuming. And then after an application period closes, it generally takes about 12 to 15 months to receive the funding, and then you'll have 3 years to complete the project. So these funds are not intended for an immediate need in any way. But through to reduce risk identified through different planning processes where you are looking out into the future. You can see the number of or the types of communities that are eligible to apply directly through DHSCM to FEMA. So that's local governments that have an approved hazard mitigation plan. And there's been a bit confusion out there. For example, if a county has a hazard mitigation plan where its municipalities and a number of special districts participate, those communities do not have to apply through the county to us. Again, they apply directly to us or through us to FEMA. So the county facilitates the planning effort, but they're not added as a step in the application process. And then the project eligibility depends on the hazard and specific activity, so that we would have a conversation, for example, with wildfire, fuels reduction, retrofits or ignition resistant construction, defensible space. Those are all eligible activities, while evacuation or ingress egress routes are not, because those don't really reduce the long-term risk of wildfire. And most hazards have some sort of delineation on what is eligible within them like that. The applications do vary by each of the programs, but again, they all come through us. And so it's our role and responsibility to assist you in your application development and make it as complete and competitive as possible. And then on the last slide, I'll give you a link to this notice of interest that's mentioned, because that really is how the process starts. The funding does vary in each of the programs, but as a general rule, FEMA would fund up to 75% of a project's cost, and that does not include any grant management costs that you may ask for as well. Next, please. Some of you may have seen this. This is an update in 2019 to the financial benefits, and there are now non-financial benefits considered to investing in hazard mitigation in your community. And you can see there with a lot of detail into 5 specific hazards across 5 different types of activities. So for example, the adopt a code column would mean your codes go above and beyond, or the activity you're implementing goes above and beyond the minimum requirements of the 2018 International Building Code or International Residential Code. But as a general rule, every dollar that you invest in hazard mitigation is going to save you $6 in the future for response costs and recovery costs. And as we all know, those costs are only going up. So it is important to make this investment in your community to, again, protect people, property, and infrastructure. Next, please. I do get asked, or I've had comments as I've traveled across the state over the last several years from communities that think it's not realistic for them to apply for funding, that think they're too small or their project is too small, that nobody wants to fund them. And nothing could be further from the truth. This slide just shows you the data that we have going back to 2011 with the number of projects and the amount those projects cost across the state. So total of 187. We currently have over 30 more applications in development from local communities. So the opportunity is out there and it's real. And TJ, I see your question. I'll get to that in just a second. I've highlighted 2 activities in red because moving forward, there's some pretty significant changes to those. With wildfire fuels reduction, for the new grant programs that FEMA announces after this month, they've removed the 2-mile limitation on fuels management around structures and infrastructure. So they did not find one anymore, although we can't spend FEMA money on national forest land or national park land or Department of Defense land. So where we encounter a federal land boundary, the project would have to stop. Generators are eligible for critical facilities that are identified in a hazard mitigation plan. So Nate, that's the answer to your question. They do tend to get a relatively low priority with FEMA's programs, but we have funded quite a few. We've also got several that were waiting for funding last night. But FEMA has recently expanded the definition of this from backup power generators to secondary power sources. So now it's expanded to microgrids, other types of renewable energy projects that would support resiliency or hazard mitigation in a community. Next, please. And again, just going back to the data we have from 2011 to now, this helps to demonstrate how realistic it is for a small community almost anywhere in Colorado to apply for funding. So for example, you can see where most of the projects over the last 12 years have sort of been focused. That's partly been driven by the natural disasters that we've had since 2012. We know, for example, that there was a flood mitigation project that we funded in the late 1990s around La Junta. Those records are really not retrievable. So there is more out there, and the opportunities are real and feasible for almost any community in Colorado. Next slide, please. And then, like Nate, I wanted to touch briefly on some other mitigation programs or funding sources that are out there. The U.S. Forest Service has a new program. They're getting ready to go, I think, into their second round of funding, the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, which funds wildfire mitigation projects identified either in a current community wildfire protection plan that is less than 10 years old, or from a current FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan, which by definition is less than 5 years old. Nate also talked about furworm. Happy to be a partner in that effort at DHSCM with the State Forest Service. There's also another source through public health, the EPA, called the Non-Point Source Pollution Grant, also known as a 319 grant, which is aimed at source water protection. So the different federal department grants, the different state grants, we all have different opportunities and constraints. So for example, the FEMA programs that I talked about can be used to mitigate risk to water infrastructure, but not to source water. And that's where CDPHE and the EPA may be a viable funding source for you if you're worried about potential wildfire debris getting into your source water. CDPHE, CWCB, and DOLA also manage some revolving loan funds that can be used in this space. There have been some uses of DOLA's mineral impact grants that I've anecdotally heard of in Western Colorado. DOLA and the Colorado Energy Office also have a microgrid for community resilience program. And then similar to DOLA's resource guide, in the state's hazard mitigation plan, we keep a pretty extensive list of all the funding capabilities that every state department has, either through state funding or that they facilitate from local funding. FEMA also provides a pretty good list to each local hazard mitigation plan when they provide the final approval packet. Next, please. It really, again, going back to the idea of long lead time and long-term or long periods of time to implement the projects that we do fund, we encourage communities to incorporate the mindset of risk reduction into all of their daily and routine operations, whether that's comprehensive planning, capital improvement planning, any community plan that touches or is touched by a natural hazard, land use decisions, code adoption, and code enforcement. It's important to note that although it's usually the emergency manager that facilitates a hazard mitigation plan in a community, it is a community plan. It's not an emergency management plan. And in fact, most of the people that we work with on hazard mitigation projects are the types of folks you see listed here. So when we send our messaging and outreach out through DOLA, for example, or through CDOT or through the CWCB, the emergency manager is also getting it. The people you see listed here are really the ones we're trying to reach. because they're the ones that have the list of projects to accomplish. They have the expertise to oversee the projects. They have the expertise to apply for the grants. So please, when you hear about opportunities for mitigation grant funding that comes from DHSCM and is funded by FEMA, that again is not really a message intended for your emergency manager. That is intended for elected and other community officials that do actually implement projects. Next, please. Sandy, I appreciate the kind words in the chat. So my contact information is there. Not normally the type to put my middle initial on stuff like this. I do that to emphasize that it is in my email address, because if you just send it to mark.thompson, I won't get it. So please take note of that if you want to reach out. You can find information about our programs at the DHSCM website. And then I've also included the link to the notice of interest, which is again the first step that you would take in applying for one of our grants. You know, I showed earlier 4 different programs. They each have their own nuances and timelines for application periods and eligibility. We do encourage communities to submit notice of interest and start working on an application at any point in time, because they are pretty intense experiences. And that way you're not rushed by a relatively short application period. But when programs do come out with deadlines, we will share that information with communities as many ways as we can. And that is my last slide. Kimberly, let me go ahead and paste that in there, and I think the slides will be shared as well.
Great, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that thorough update. And again, thanks to Nate for his presentation. Are there specific questions? And there's been a few questions or comments throughout the presentation. Is there anything more at this moment that we can go to a formal question and answer session, which will be facilitated by Ann Miller?
Yes, good morning all. There is a question from Kimberly, and Mark, this is for you. Do you know if FEMA considers or has approved generator funding for healthcare facilities such as assisted living, skilled nursing facilities, hospitals, etc.?
I don't know if we have in Colorado. I don't believe we have, but they do fund those. Again, those critical facilities do need to be identified in the hazard mitigation plan, which is updated every few years and can be updated along the way as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And I'll just share. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, I don't mean to interrupt, just very quickly. Mark, during the course of his presentation, mentioned some of the restrictions around land ownership types that federal funding can be used for. And that just jogged my memory. And it's worth noting that the COSWAP program, so the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, does not carry any land ownership types or type restrictions. And so it's a really great option to help sort of build transboundary projects, given that it can be used on all of those land ownership types and help sort of bring disparate projects and land ownerships together. So just wanted to make that note. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you all. I'm not seeing any additional questions come in yet.
Hey, Ann.
Yeah.
There's one in the chat from Sandy. So the hazard mitigation plan is a requirement for FEMA funding for the projects, and then it's an alternative requirement for the U.S. Forest Services program if you do have a CWPP that's more than 10 years old.
Okay, thank you. And Mark, would you mind copying your link to the notice of interest? It just went to host and panelists versus everyone. Thank you.
You bet.
All right, thanks. I am going to turn it back to Rick now.
Thanks, Dan. If other questions surface in the remaining time, we can certainly take a few minutes to respond. Again, thanks to the presenters, Mark Thompson and Nate Pearson, for their overview of the latest on hazard mitigation funding. Thank you both for being with us. This is the time for the engagement survey, and I think Jimmy Barrera from our Colorado Resiliency Office is going to manage that. Jimmy?
Thank you, Rick. Good morning, guys. As Rick mentioned earlier in our program, the Regional Infrastructure Development Summits, they're coming up soon, and we have developed a survey for local government feedback. This is to ensure that the summits are tailored to regional needs and priorities. In place of our engagement survey today, we wanted to ensure you have access to the survey and give you some time to either fill it out or forward to appropriate staff. If you have any questions about it, you can contact Alyssa Dinberg, who is available to answer those. But I will add it here to the chat if you want to take a moment to look at it.
And also just adding that Alyssa is on today. If you have any questions that you want to ask at this time, please feel free to do so.
Thanks, Jill. There is one thing I just want to mention. You may all be wondering who the most appropriate person in your organization to fill this survey out. The person that we're really looking to fill this survey out is somebody that has a broad understanding across the organization what your ability is and ability to go after federal funding, but also what your organization's need is. We understand that there are program staff on this call. We understand that there are specific disciplines that you all represent. And so we're really looking for somebody that has that broad view, whether that be the city manager, or if you have a grants manager, maybe even a finance director. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, thanks, Alyssa. Any other questions for Alyssa since we have her attention on the upcoming summits or the survey? Any other questions related to today's agenda?
Not seeing any more come in.
Okay, super. Well, thank you all, local government folks, for participating and listening today. We hope you continue to find these coordination calls useful, beneficial, and certainly the pathways to recovery and resiliency funding webinars also helpful and of value. Please let us know. Just shoot us an email or an IM, and we certainly would take all feedback seriously to make adjustments if necessary. So with that, we're going to adjourn today's local government coordination call. We'll see you again next month. Everyone have a great rest of the day.